when I moved to Minneapolis, started working downtown, and I was struck by the fact that what should have been the oldest part of town, close to the river, was kind of a dead zone, full of like buildings from the 1950s and 60s, soulless blocks. I mentioned it to a friend. He and I shared a love of dive bars. He said, "Oh, you got to see this video." It was of TPTs down on Skid Row. And I was just stunned. It was this city that I didn't recognize. This is such a different place than I have encountered. What happened to this place?
At one time, almost every major American city had an area called Skid Row. In Minneapolis, it was over 20 square blocks of bars, flop houses, and missions, centered around Gateway Park and Washington Avenue.
In 1952, the city counted 62 liquor stores, bars, beer parlors within this 20-block area. Most major cities had a Skid Row. They tended to be around the railroad stations, and they tended to be the oldest part of town, cheapest real estate, cheapest lodging houses. These were the places where there was a transient labor market. Milwaukee Depot and the Great Northern Depot were kind of bracketed the old Gateway District. It was also called Lower Loop, the oldest part of Minneapolis, built in the 19th century. By the 1950s, it was really kind of seedy. You would see a kind of a crumbling city center, a lot of secondhand shops, bars, liquor stores, but probably your eye would be immediately drawn to just the clamor on the sidewalks. Older men jostling, drinking, sleeping, fighting, whistling at you, begging, panhandling. It was notorious. Everybody knew. And they would say this was a place where their parents would take them downtown, drive through down Washington Avenue with the hordes of guys causing trouble or laying about on the sidewalk. If you don't stay in school, this is where you're going to end up. This is the nadir of human existence. If you don't behave yourself and study hard, this is your future.
You had to be brave. You had to be brave to go into those kinds of spaces. These men and these women relied on secrecy, on that kind of general aura of disreputableness that the Gateway had, that Skid Row had. If you were there, you were either changing streetcar lines, because of course they were still all interchanging there. So there was some respectable reason to be there, at least until the streetcars were discontinued. But in general, if you were down there, you were probably up to no good. And the general understanding was, we're gonna let them be up to no good, but we're only gonna let them do it there.
From 1955 to 1961, John Bacich filmed life on the streets outside his Washington Avenue bar, documenting the last years down on Skid Row.
It was a different way of life for different people. People live in Edina, people live in South Minneapolis, they don't know what's going on in Skid Row. Well, maybe they see how some other people live. You know, like once in a while you see the rich and the famous, maybe you ought to see the poor and the alcoholics.
John Bacich, his last name was so difficult to pronounce for a lot of people on Skid Row that they called him Johnny Rex because he was the king of Skid Row. His family had operated a nightclub and restaurant, supper club in northern Wisconsin. And so he kind of went into the family business in a way and opened a liquor store and eventually a bar in the Gateway District. He felt compelled whenever he saw something happening on the streets outside his bar or his liquor store, or his flop house, to run out there with his camera and shoot some footage of it. He's a very good photographer, really had an eye, an extraordinary eye, also an extraordinary narrator, as he did the voiceover for his film years after he actually shot it.
It make no difference to them when they were decide to sleep in it.
I think anyone who watches it is a little disturbed by the content because it is about kind of marginal community life, Skid Row. what comes through to me watching this documentary with him as a narrator, that you have to regard him as unreliable, even if he offers some truths about his life or the people that he's around. I'm a historian. I guess I've been trained to think about unreliable narrators because when I go into archives to try to write Indian history and to tell Native perspectives of the past, I have to read and filter through so many documents written by missionaries, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the head of government boarding schools, other people who were trying to kind of press their agenda.
What we do in the morning, people would be sick or something, so I'd give them all a drink for a nickel. And by the time
You could see him as a protector of these men. He gave them shelter. He gave them jobs. He treated them as human beings. He thought of them individually. He was fascinated with them as people. He told me that when someone wanted to get clean, he would help them get clean, especially if they were a veteran like him, and a lot of them were. But he was also serving them 5-cent eye-opener beers in the morning to cure the DTs. And they would die sometimes in his flop house. In the view of a lot of people, he was a parasite himself. He was a predator.
I didn't do it just because I need the business, but when a man is sick in the morning, he has to have one little drink to straighten him out. But eventually he gets pretty sick and nothing helps him.
He was not nostalgic about it per se. He clearly loved these guys. He clearly loved being the king of Skid Row. But he also recognized, and anyone who sees his film, it's no nostalgia trip. It's often very difficult to watch. The degradation, the violence, and just the hopelessness and the scourge of alcoholism. At the time when the decisions were being made to bulldoze Skid Row, these people were described as parasites and deviant. And I think he was always trying to lend some humanity to them.
My name is John Bacich, and I took this film at Skid Row down on Washington Avenue in Minneapolis so that people could see what it was all about in the late 50s. This film now is 26 years old, unrehearsed, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. These were the flop houses that were along Washington Avenue. One after another above the bars were flop houses. They're made of nothing but plywood on the sides and then chicken wire at the top so that somebody that was living there couldn't crawl up to the other guy's little room and steal his property. As you see, everybody there drank wine because they had nothing else to do. They just had a cot, they had a little table, and there's stuff there. I remember one fella had about 20 coats, and when I looked at him, he had these cheap watches. He must have had 100 of them. I don't think altogether they were worth $3, but and he got these coats. I don't know where he got them, but he had about 100. These fellas were usually railroad workers that came up from the south and worked on a railroad all summer long, and then in the winter, all they would do was draw unemployment, which would equal whatever they made in the summer. And so all they do is sit up there and drink and wait till spring came. Now, some of these fellas, like you see looking at the window, were old-timers. One fellow there was a Finnish fellow that in Minneapolis owned about 30 houses, and he lived down there because he loved to just sit among his cronies. He'd buy them a bottle of beer, and they'd listen to, or a bottle of wine, they'd listen to anything he had to say. These buildings were some of the oldest buildings in Minneapolis along there. The version of Skid Row is, people think it's men on the downgrade going down, skidding down to the end of their life, but it isn't that. It's from the skids when they used to send big logs from the forest down. Now, if you look at these pictures, you'll see this Nicollet Avenue where the big bank is and big high-rises. This is on the corner of Marquette. And regardless, these fellas treated a lady like a lady down there. In fact, of all the Gannies, I had as many 60 in my hotel. When my wife would come along, I never heard one of them swear. Here, gentlemen, this is Nicollet, Panning Nicollet, now going down to 2nd Street. And you know, all you could see there, this is nothing but liquor stores and beer parlors, and upstairs was these flop houses, and a little cafe in between. And this fellow here, he'd go around and look for empty bottles and find maybe a little drop here or there. It's all he did all day long, just picking up wherever he found a bottle. He just Talk about germs. I don't think that guy, anything would kill him. He'd get together, you know, and throw their money together. They called that the Frisco pool. And then when they got enough money to buy a bottle, they would. When they got drunk, they just lay down and sleep wherever they were. This guy, I don't know, his face was quite a characteristics of Skid Row. This fella here, he would drink a full quart, and I didn't believe it. So now this was rehearsed because I said to him, I'll give you a $5 bill if you drink that, and he drank it twice. And once in a while, the boy, I'd feel kind of generous, and I'd take a whole case of half pints there and set it out, and the guys would run and get it. And regardless of who got what, they would sit there. I know one thing they would do, they'd share. That's Curly in the middle. I'll tell you a story about him. This one going right by there. He said, it's all out now. See, none of them go in the alley and start drinking. The police kept a pretty good handle on these fellas down there, and I think you had a heck of a lot less trouble down there during Skid Row than you do in some of the parts of Minneapolis now. That's what they do. They just pass it around, they'd share and put some money here. This guy was a farmer, the one in the plaid shirt. Boy, they could consume that stuff, too. And the reason they drank wine, especially Muscatel, that was their favorite, and then port. And Muscatel, they call it, there's different names. We call it Wenatchee bourbon or Polish pop or different names for it, is because it was sweet and killed their appetites until they got the DTs. Now, this couple of Indians, they were cousins, and they would sit there and they would just see who was the best. And I mean, they would really fight. And I'd hurt every time I'd see him hitting it. And here's old Nick, he'd get up there, and this was his way of getting his kicks. He'd get up on top of the building and pretend that he was the king of the mountains. He'd crawl up that fire escape and go up there every day, whether he was drunk or sober. I don't know what it was, but he just loved to go up on the roofs. But if I saw him drinking, I wouldn't let him go up there, but he couldn't very well stop him because I couldn't be there 24 hours a day. This is one of the hotels that I own, called the Rex. Funny part of one time, some girls wrote down they wanted to go to a basketball tournament and asked me if they could get 8 rooms, and I wrote back and I said, if you did, you wouldn't be the same. This is a flop house on Skid Row, and I don't know where they stayed, but they're going to a basketball tournament. This is Whitey. He'd sleep any place. He was from Detroit, and this fellow would sleep in the abandoned buildings, and in the winter, he would just go in an old boxcar and have a bunch of cardboard, and he'd put some on the top, some on the bottom, and sleep between the cardboard. He was a strong character. He'd work, make just enough to feed himself and drink, and then he was really a character. I mean, he had a real pleasing personality. You could see his nose there from when they get drunk, they get in a fight. And here's the park where they used to sleep during the day. Nobody'd bother them. They'd sit out there and get a bottle and fall asleep. This park here is between Nicollet and Hennepin Avenue and Washington and 2nd Street. And this was a little story about a dog that got this pigeon in his mouth, and these fellas had a big argument about what they should do with the pigeon. Some wanted to take it away. The others said leave it alone, so I took it away from the dog. It wasn't hurt that bad. And we're panning Washington Avenue. You see there's a tavern, there's a loan shop, another tavern, drugstore, there's another bar, and here's mine, the sourdough, which is, you can see I got Ketchikan because my brother-in-law had a sourdough bar in Ketchikan, so I named it after him. He's a transportation commissioner in Alaska now. And this is some more panning. There's a cafe in between. Here's Nick and Amo as they'd pull each other's nose all year round. They'd get a few drinks, and sometimes they weren't even drunk, and they'd just be pushing each other, and then they'd grab each other's nose. They just got a big kick out of that. It was something to watch them too. And they were real good buddies. They're both from Indiana. They were railroad workers like the rest of them. In fact, everybody I had in my Skid Row hotel were railroad workers. This is in front of my bar. It was something. They'd get a little rough, but they never got really mad. They'd wrestle themselves on the floor and everything and bang down. Here it is, snow, rain, sleet. Here they are at it again. And it was just amazing. They just grabbed for each other's nose. Nobody else, as you know, paid much attention when they figured a little bit wacky anyhow. But they probably were. But they were nice boys. Those days, them hotel rates were about 50 cents a day. One of the fellows owned a bunch of them flop houses, lived in California, one of the richest men down there. I think he owned about 12 flop houses here. There's old Amo, he'd go around and dress up. Some days he'd come in just his shorts, and then he'd put on a gunny sack, and he was just a comic. You notice once in a while some of the fellows would turn around and won't let you take their picture. I imagine they were connected with some crime sometime. This was the old professor. He knew everything. This is just some of the boys wanted to get their pictures in. This is Collins. He was a fighter. He and his brother got in a fight, and this is what happened to him, so we're waiting for the paddy wagon. It seemed that if you were a fighter, it was just like in the old Western days. Everybody was out to try to best you, but they'd wait till you were so drunk, some of these boys, and then they'd really give it to them, which was pitiful. And this is old Wild Bill Waddling Duck. The policeman just went by. Now they're taking Collins into the police car to the police station. Like King Tut, he was another one that I used to feed him every day because he'd get in a fight, and it was just unbelievable.
The Minneapolis Police Department at that time sort of had a special unit that would patrol the Gateway. And from the other officers in the force, they kind of let them do their thing. You know, John described as a business owner having to pay off the police with liquor and money, and there was just an expectation that they would leave you alone. But the police were a constant presence.
There was almost like this cottage industry in the police department where these men would get you drunk, they would get into fights, the cops would show up, they'd put him in the paddy wagon, they'd take him down to what they called the bullpen, they'd let him sober up, and then they'd let him go. And it was like just over and over and over and over again. So some of these men probably went to jail, dozens and dozens and dozens of times.
So we're standing at the corner of 2nd Street and Nicollet Avenue, except they're not here anymore. They're gone. This is the old Block 10, which was the heart of the Gateway District and the heart of Skid Row. This would have been Rex Liquors on the corner, John Bacich's liquor store, where, you buy a pint of liquor for 25 cents or 50 cents. All of his institutions were on this block. He had the Victor Hotel, which was right down in the mid-block. On the other side, on Washington Avenue, was the Sourdough Bar, which served residents of his flop house and was supplied by liquor from his liquor store. So he really had sort of the trifecta here. This block had about 8 bars and 3 liquor stores and a number of flop houses, and it was everything the city was trying to get rid of.
44% of crime in 1957 took place in Skid Row. So when you have that much crime going on, the police aren't asking questions as to why it's happening. They assume it's drunkenness, they assume it's the 3,000 homeless men who are living there.
The city had been concerned about this neighborhood for 50 plus years. Even when it was in its heyday, it was a seedy neighborhood. Late 19th century, they already got concerned about it. So over the decades, there had been various attempts to do something about it by building institutions like the big post office and Gateway Park right in the middle of it. And they would clear some of the buildings away with the hope that if they built a park, well, good people will come and the people we don't want will go away. Well, none of it really worked.
I remember one time when I saw a guy laying there, he was bleeding and everything else, and I got excited and called the police. They said, just leave him alone. He'll be all right. He'll take care of himself eventually. And I guess I'd get too excited when I first got down there. Now here was the old Black Mariah or the paddy wagon. They'd put him in there. Some days it would be something. They had an old policeman there was from the old school, and he'd put the guy's head at the bottom step and roll him up and just hit him, and he'd roll up like a ball in there. It was interesting to do it. This is a scene in Human Relations that shows this fella. He was kicked out of his room, and as he's walking down the street, his suitcase opened up and stuff spilled all over. And he was saying, if you're going to take my picture, I want a couple bucks. And he got up, you know. And then as he got up, the old vultures come in. They start picking up just like chickens going when you throw some feed to them. This guy picked up the blade razor. The other guy picked up the soap. By the time he got through arguing, there wasn't nothing left. I don't know if they had any use for it. They'd pick it up anyhow. This is kind of a picture I took of a bootlegger. You can see him back there selling wine on Sunday. He'd sell about 10, 20 cases in the morning, one after another. He'd just go in and out, go in and out. And somebody told him I was taking his picture. You can see him now just to the sign that says soft drinks in there. Buck a throw he was getting for that wine, cost him about 40 cents. He'd sell about 10, 20 drinks. And he got excited and he came out. He figured I was going to do something. He got in his car. This him walking to his car. He had about 10, 12 different cars. So that he thought that the police didn't know anything about it, but they knew who he was. They'd knock him off every once in a while. But them bootleggers were pretty mercenary. They made a lot of money, but they never would help out anybody. This is the fellow I told you about. He was booked in Montana. And he just said he didn't want to go to jail, so he jumped out the window, but it was the second floor, and he landed on the concrete below and ruptured his spleen a little bit in his shoulder and went to the hospital, and they had a big article about it. I have it home, and he wouldn't let him interview him unless he gave him $10. This fellow was with Lawrence Welkin's orchestra. He was a piano player. He'd come in all dressed up like this after he'd been working on a farm or someplace, and then in about a month later, he looked like the rest of them. But he could play the piano because we had a piano, and he was really a good piano player. He was really a nice-dressed gentleman when he'd come in, but after about 2 or 3 weeks of drinking, boy, what a change. There's Whitey again and some of his buddies. Somebody hit him over the head with a pipe. This is old Doc. He was a die-hard Republican, and he knew everything was going on, too. He's another philosopher. There's Doc. He was one of the gays. In fact, he was the old man of the gays there. He was quite a character.
Watching down on Skid Row, suddenly there's this older guy, and he's, in this suit, and he does this funny, kind of weird little dance. And, Bacich says, that's old Doc, one of the gays. In fact, he was the old man of the gays. He was quite a character. And then it moves on. That's what you get. And that's one of those moments where I saw that and I thought, there has to be more. There has to be more to this. It is very difficult to find those stories. People intentionally kept hidden, and they were good at it. They had to be. When we talk about those bars at that time that served gay and bisexual men as well as women, they weren't gay bars the way that we think of them now. So there's no club music, there's no go-go boys, there's no dancing. It is a place that is often owned by straight people. It's entirely possible that folks who went to the Sourdough, folks who went to the Dugout or the Trocadero, most of the people who were there didn't know that it was also well known as a popular spot for gay men and bisexual men. They would often kind of congregate in the back, and almost always at night. So this is not a daytime type of thing. This is only under the cover of darkness. At that time, there were no gay newspapers, no television, no radio, no nothing. So you had to rely off of these informal networks of communication. Locally, I know that the men's restrooms in bus stations and train stations were the place to go if you needed to know where to go. From there, you would then learn that you go to the Onyx, or later on you go to the Dugout or the Trocadero or Persian Palms, depending on the night. All that was written in graffiti on these restroom stalls. Or as you got to know people, you would learn more. Because there wasn't a large national idea of what being gay meant or being bisexual meant, there was oddly more freedom for men to have sexual experiences with other men. It was just kind of recreational. They didn't talk about it. They'd do it down on Skid Row, and then they'd go home. There were lots of hourly rate hotels nearby. There were lots of semi-public areas, alleyways, bathrooms, bathhouses were still in operation at this time. There was one at the lumber exchange that was quite popular. I read 1,400 arrest records. Not once does the word homosexual appear. I think that the police just didn't want to go there. They wouldn't know what to do. Technically, sodomy was illegal in Minnesota at the time, but the important thing to note about that is it meant something different back then. Sodomy was just any form of non-procreative sexual activity. It was used as kind of a trump charge to add on to the potential number of charges you could give somebody. So sex workers were often charged with sodomy. Thinking about Down on Skid Row, thinking about Bacich and how he talks about these men, you get a sense that so many people just overlooked them, that this was kind of like human garbage. You get a sense that he at once appreciates their humanity. He does see them as people, he knows them, he sees himself as taking care of them. At the same time, he's profiting off of them. And I wonder if the police were the same way. That they were benefiting off of them, that they were taking advantage of them. It's entirely possible that men who got caught in compromising circumstances with other men were kind of roughed up by the police or charged by the police. If they did, they certainly wouldn't have complained about it, because who are they going to tell? They would have to risk outing themselves in order to say this happened, and then their lives would be over.
This is the line that would go down to the brothers had a free lunch place on Nicollet Island, so they'd line up like this and wait till they opened up for lunch. One of these guys was bragging. He says, "I don't have to eat here, this free meal at the brothers. I got plenty of money." And some of my Gandhi says when he got through eating, he was just as broke as the rest of them. They relieved him of his money while he was eating. I imagine the lines now are even bigger than they were then. And a lot of them would have money, but they'd go in there because they get a free meal. What we do in the morning, people would be sick or something, so I'd give them all a drink for a nickel. And by the time I opened up 10 minutes later, the bar would be just filled to capacity. And I didn't do it just because I need the business, but when a man is sick in the morning, he has to have one little drink to straighten him out. But eventually he gets pretty sick and nothing helps him. There's Whitey again. See, the sign says Johnny Rex is going. That was my nickname because my attorney gave me that name. He said, "You're the king of Skid Row," so they called me Johnny Rex. That's the only name they know me by. And it says Johnny Rex was going because they were going to tear it down. And the last day we were open, we really had a party, and I gave everybody free drinks until we closed up. And that's Mabel. She was a chieftain's daughter. And she's got, her daughters are there too. You can see them sitting up at the bar. Quite a conglomeration of people, bootleggers, muggers, jack rollers. If you ever had any money there, you'd better keep quiet because in about 10 minutes it'd be gone. One farmer there was loaded, and I told him, "You better go and give it to the police for keep it secure," and he didn't. They relieved him of his money, and he come crying. He said, "What should I do?" I said, "I suppose you better go home and get some more pigs. I don't know what else you can do. We told you to take it and give it to the police, and they'd give you a receipt." That's Rena, one of Mabel's daughters. She doesn't look like that now, but she was a pretty little girl. I had doctors used to come in and talk to me that were on Skid Row, and lawyers and everything. A lot of Indians, as you can see in the alleys. They'd come down from the reservation, just get drunk, and then go back up there when they were broke.
About the time that this film was made, the federal government decided that they sort of wanted to get out of the Indian business. They didn't want to abide by all these promises made in treaties in the 19th century for health, for education, and these other things that Native people had negotiated for very seriously. So the federal government saying, you Indian people, this is so expensive. We've certainly paid our debt to you by now. We want to get out of the Indian business, and we're going to withdraw services from your reservation communities. So that was one policy, but the twin policy was relocation. And the idea of relocation was that the federal government would assist Native people moving into urban cities.
Single girls are often helped to move into supervised girls' clubs.
So that there were a lot of people who came to Minneapolis during the relocation years. For a lot of reasons that any of us might gravitate to urban areas, people thought there would be a chance for opportunity, for jobs, for the kids to go to good schools. But the problem became that when American Indians came to Minneapolis and St. Paul in the 1950s or even in the 1960s, they didn't find open arms. They were discriminated against tremendously in housing. And then in terms of jobs, it was difficult for Native people to kind of get a foothold here. I think sometimes people don't understand these issues of poverty in the United States as, you know, if you're poor, living in your rural reservation or your small town, why don't you just move someplace else, right, where there's jobs and opportunity? Well, what if you have no money to go there? These young women leaving Red Lake and the security of home and family, they didn't have enough money to even get to Minneapolis. They had to stop and do farm labor. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have an uncle or parents or someone to kind of get you set up in the city, it's very hard to navigate and do those things on your own. Native people are vulnerable to alcoholism and substance abuse like other people. It was historically an issue because often the American leaders brought in a lot of alcohol at times of negotiation. So alcohol has been sort of used against Native people. So we have a very strange and conflicted relationship, I think, with the history of alcohol.
I would sell in that bar about 5 barrels of beer alone a day, besides wine and liquor. I had one bartender, he worked there, and after one day he slipped a note under my office. He says, "My God, my life was in jeopardy all day long." He says, "Just send me the check." He says, "I can't take it." That gal there that just took the gentleman's hat in the middle of the bar, her parents left her a fortune in Montana, a whole square block of most important property in the town. And she'd come in and buy everybody drinks. Then they had a big brass bell there in the bar, and if you wanted to buy everybody a drink, you had to ring the bell. Now, this fella here, I didn't like him because he tried to pick up the women, and I think he was a sadist of some kind. I didn't like him at all. And I don't think very many other people liked him. This was one of the bartenders worked for me, and I told him never grab a bottle out of somebody's hand when they're drinking, even though they weren't supposed to in my bar. And this fellow was drinking in a men's restroom a pint of wine, and he went in there and he just grabbed it out of his hand real quick, and before he could say uncle, he had all these, now he's pretty well healed up. He had 180 stitches put in all through his whole body from the neck all the way down to his knees. This is a guy we called Santa Claus, and he kept telling everybody he was the original Santa Claus. But he wouldn't pose for nothing. I had to give him a couple bucks. "I am the original Santa Claus," he's saying. Now, if you see him like that, a beard, you wouldn't even pay no attention to him. This was a fellow that was running my hotel. We didn't have any trends. Everybody we had would stay there by the month, because this was Moonface. She was one of the nicest gals I ever known. Had a personality like crazy. She'd come in at 8 o'clock and wouldn't leave till 1 in the morning. And you'd be surprised of her boyfriend that would pick her up. I mean, well-dressed, very, very important gentlemen. I won't mention names, but some are quite notable in the city, and I couldn't believe it.
There's a huge problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We haven't, as a society, acknowledged the violence toward Native women that exists. And when Native women or people from Skid Row historically have gone missing, I think what happened to them, because you know that they are a more vulnerable population than some of the men. I wonder if this is a problem that isn't just of the last couple of decades and our conversations now about sexual trafficking and so forth. If the roots of that are in these marginal spaces in urban areas like Skid Row. I had just read Louise Erdrich's new novel called The Night Watchman, which is about a really important era in American Indian history. And in the book, she has a character who comes to Minneapolis, who is a young woman that many people kind of take advantage of in the city. And I thought she had really wonderful descriptions of Skid Row and what it was like to be in a flop house, or what the environment was like, or how women might be exploited in that context. Very vivid descriptions that also come from maybe a female point of view that would be interesting to pair with the documentary.
There were women in the Gateway District vastly outnumbered by men, like 25-1. There were sex workers, absolutely. John talks about that in his movie.
For women who wanted relationships with other women, you had to navigate a lot because you might have been assumed to be a sex worker. There was a bizarre city ordinance in Minneapolis that banned 2 women from entering a bar together unescorted by a man. The idea was that if you had 2 women go into this place, they were probably sex workers who would leave with the man.
For some of the issues that we raised, murdered and missing women, what was going on at a time when American society rejected a lot of people, right? Your sexuality, your ethnicity. And so I think that studying spaces like this in urban areas has value, but they're very complicated, and we have to bring a lot of understanding to what we're seeing.
Here's our buddy again drinking another quart of wine. Just look at that, not a drop is spilled. That's a full quart of wine, no fakes. I used to give a couple gallons free from the liquor store. I had a liquor store there too, in the morning when I first opened up. And we'd make him come at the end of the line because if he started, he'd probably drink up a whole gallon. This fella on the right was real rough, that little guy. Here's Nick and them. About 10 below, and they're going at it. Here's a little old fella. He's going to go get a bottle, and he's cooling off. That's second and Nicollet there. This guy was really something. Got a lot of personality. Here's old Kelly the Clown. Now notice he's walking barefoot in the wintertime. You'd think they'd get sick, but I don't know one of them ever got a cold or anything. I don't know why they did this. I guess they just, because they got their kicks at it. I said, aren't your feet cold? He said, nah. He tried to shoot a fellow one time and with a .25 caliber pistol, but he said the reason he didn't shoot him was because he had a .22 shell in the gun, so he says, I know how to do it now. He says, I take and put thread around the shell, and he says, when I put it in, it'll fit in the chamber, and he says, I can get him this time. And he's now in Chicago. He quit drinking, and he's a janitor. Kelly the Clown. He's got a face just like old Kelly. Some of them fellows would have short fuses. Him and old Whitey, they got in a pretty good. Pat's his real name. They got in a pretty good argument there because he wanted to drink Pat, didn't he? Wouldn't give one. Now, this is what the fellows would do when they had not much to do, not much to play around with. They'd sit in a hotel and they'd, like I say, like a San Francisco pool, they'd throw in whatever change you had. This the fellow used to play the piano now, you can see him. And then they would get enough money and they'd buy, if they had enough to buy a gallon, they'd buy a gallon. If they had enough to buy a half gallon, here they got a half a gallon. Then they'd grab that bottle and they'd take turns going around from one to another. A lot of these fellows were veterans too. One fellow, I asked him, he was one of the best tinsmiths I've ever seen. He could make knives out of tin. He could make anything. He said, John, I had 2 jobs in Chicago, and there wasn't enough to satisfy my wife. Finally, one day, I said, to hell with it. He says, I got drunk. I went up to a flop house in Chicago. I got drunk. I found out about the railroad workers. I went to work there, and he said, I've never been back since. And other fellows lived right over here from 26 to 26 Minneapolis. And he says, my relations fought over my mother and dad's house, and that was just too much. And he says, I walked across the street in disgust, and I talked to some of the railroad workers that were working in the big shipyards there, and told me that they go out every once in a while, and then they go down to Skid Row and have a good time. He says, I joined them, and until the day he died, he never went back to his home, although he was living down in Washington Avenue. But he was at the Veterans Hospital, and I finally got a hold of his relations, but he didn't want to have nothing to do with them. A lot of these fellas, I know you feel sorry for them, and people say, yeah, they lived a miserable life, but they says, what we don't want is responsibility. And down here, we can do what we want. We don't have to worry about paying bills, raising kids, paying payments on cars or houses and this and that. That was their choosings. Of all of them that I know down there, I don't think there was one or maybe even two that ever really sobered up. Most of them died at early age in their 40s. This was an Indian boy that had gotten a fight with one of his buddies, and he crawled in under there. Now, it was about, I'd say about 10 above. And they had tar pitched roofs there, and you can imagine he was hot and warm when he lay down, and he fell asleep, and this is what happened. It embedded right into the cuts and out of his face. It was pitiful, and he couldn't feel anything because his whole face was numb. And he got all cut up because his friend had a knife, and I guess he worked him over pretty good, so I took him out to General Hospital. And they must have had some job trying to clean him up, get that tar out of his cuts and that. Skid Row was quite an experience, but I never want to go through it again. And they start for a fight. Now, this guy here took a swing at this old guy for no reason at all. He must be a little tooky, because he just took a swing at him. I went up and really told him off. I said, you'd hit him, and I'd have hit you all over the place. Just leave him alone. Here, look, this is the Persian palms, and this was Stockholm. These are different environments. Stockholm, during the Depression, used to turn the taps of beer on, and they would never turn them off. They had that much business. This was during the Depression. And the Persian Pound, which was just down a few doors, sold more champagne than any place in the world. There's a little scene across over there. This fella's deaf and dumb, and his girlfriend. But he'd get a few drinks, and boy, he'd give her a hard time.
By the 1950s, American cities in general were starting to get really worried about their future. In Minneapolis in particular, when General Mills, which had been headquartered downtown, announced it was moving to Golden Valley in the mid-1950s, that was kind of a shot across the bow that we need to do something about the Gateway District. They proposed what was the most ambitious downtown redevelopment project in the nation's history. It entailed the demolition of 40% of downtown Minneapolis, nearly 200 buildings in a 3-year period. And with it, all of the homes for the better part of 3,000 people. Men of the Gateway, these were not guys who left behind memoirs, who wrote letters, who were sort of joining clubs where their names would be known. A lot of them were alcoholics, but not all of them, which is interesting. Some of them just wanted to live in a more communal environment with the companionship of other men. The Gateway was also one of the other institutions that was very common were all of these rescue missions, religious organizations that viewed the problems of these Skid Row residents as a moral one. They would offer shelter. It was not very fancy. Often you'd be sitting on a chair or sleeping right on the floor, but you first had to listen to a sermon, an ear beating, some of them called it. And these missions served a really important role in the community in terms of housing some of these guys, but I don't know what their track record was in terms of salvation. Jerome Liebeling plays a really interesting role in this. You know, he was the head of the photography department at the University of Minnesota in the early 1960s, sort of a pioneer in documentary film and photography. Jerome Liebeling met with John and was fascinated with the fact that he shot footage of this place. And so the art department at the University of Minnesota got a hold of John's footage, and they stitched together the movies. I think it accounts for some of the more artful editing that happened there. I think the film is so powerful because it portrays a community that doesn't exist anymore. It wasn't just a collection of alcoholics. It wasn't just a social blight. These were human beings with their own stories.
So right now we're standing on the North Washington Avenue 100 block, and this was the edge of the redevelopment area where there's a Whole Foods market now, but it was a Pontiac and then a Jaguar dealership, which had been put in after the Gateway redevelopment. But you do get some older structures here, and these buildings here give you an idea of what might have happened if they'd left the Gateway alone.
We often lament the loss of the historic architecture. That's what I've seen in a lot of folks who talk about that area is it's too bad that all those beautiful old buildings got demolished. But the real tragedy is the loss of those options, that place in the city where you could let your hair down, where you could be yourself, and the rules of society didn't apply.
Everyone knew this era was coming to an end, but what was so strange about it was that for the rest of the city and the state, they described these men as strangers, as if they didn't know where they came from, when in fact, these were the people who built the upper Midwest.
Now, this is a little Polish friend of mine, and they lived down there. This is the fellow I told you about was tinsmith. And see, they go down there when they want to sober up. Underneath the 3rd Avenue Bridge, there's a little jungle down there, and they go down there, and there's a creek where water runs from the rocks. And they'd put a little old canvas, whatever they could find over there, and they'd sleep there night and day, rain or anything. They'd live there sometimes 2-3 weeks, sometimes a couple months, and they'd fish carp out of that river. Now, I've seen them catch carp 30-pounders easily. That was pure water, too. It's still there, the spring is. Comes right out of the side of the hills. This is just some more of the jungle by the 3rd Avenue Bridge. Pretty steep climbing sometimes. Now, this jungle was west of the old Great Northern Station, right along the Mississippi River, where they're going to put a huge bunch of condominiums and a shopping center and everything else. And a lot of fellows were there, and quite a few Indian girls, and see the gunboats there where they cooked their meals and so forth. One of these fellas, it's in this picture, he went out to the West Coast, and I saw him a few years ago, and he married a contractor's wife, and he's a rich man out there. I couldn't believe it. He pulled up in a big Cadillac and said, "Do you remember me, Johnny Rex?" Well, I didn't remember him, but after a while, I could recognize his face, but I didn't know what his name was. They lived there. See, this was a place where they'd catch the trains going through Minneapolis. They knew just about when they arrived. There, you have to really look out in the jungles because a lot of transients come to, and some of them were pretty rough. There's one old-timer that was at the hotel, and we found out that he had murdered a couple of fellas. Now, this is the gunboats, which is nothing but a big old can, usually for coffee or some kind of a food, and these fellas would go out, somebody would go out and wrestle up a few bucks, and then he'd go and buy some pork, another fellow would get some beans, and they'd pour in some of that water, and boy, they made soup that just wouldn't quit. They found this fellow face down over in Nicollet Island. I think somebody murdered him, so they'd ask me if I knew any of these fellows that would get hurt or something like that, because I kept a regular photographic album of all these fellows. I'd take their pictures, come in, and I knew them, and I notified his next of kin. In fact, I think I know who killed him, but I wasn't positive. But some of the fellows told me. This, what was Nicollet Island was. What a change. Here's one of the fellows, like I told you, jungle going to meet the trains. Train would stop there to be switched, and they'd get on. Here's our friend going back, all dressed up. Just kind of going over and showing you some of the old places again. Now, this is the beginning of the end of Skid Row. You can see how fast these buildings went down because there was no steel in them whatsoever, just wood and brick. And all they had to do was swing that big old bucket, just barely hit it, and it'd fall down. Thank God we never had a fire there. That whole area would have burned. It's a fire escape.
The demolition of the Gateway had been proposed and theorized for 50 years before it actually happened. So the city kept trying and kept trying and kept trying to get rid of all these buildings and all these people who were there. Skid Row was a threat to development. It was a threat to the health of the city. Southdale Mall had opened. People were starting to move out into the suburbs. And so the city was getting desperate and they were getting scared. So overnight, all these places are gone. And wouldn't you know it, within a few years, you start to see the happy hour starts to pick up in business. Later on in the 70s, you see the Brass Rail becomes a gay bar. You can see that these places tried to stay as close as humanly possible to where the Gateway was. And it's almost like if you think of a pool table and you knock a ball and it just shoots off in this direction. That's what happened. Skid Row gets demolished and folks just move out along Hennepin out towards Uptown. The Twin Cities Pride Parade route begins near Hennepin, Nicollet, and Washington in the remnants of Skid Row, and it moves out along Hennepin to Loring Park. I don't know if the organizers intended to recreate this exodus every year, but that's what it does. You start at the place where the known world of the LGBTQ community begins, and then you move out, as they did, out towards Loring Park. And I would argue that the Twin Cities Pride route is an echo of that loss. Nobody thought of it, nobody intended it, but it's almost like a record groove. It was so deeply ingrained for so long that even after all the buildings are gone, even after all of its, distant memory now, you're still recreating that same thing. You cannot demolish behavior. If you demolish the buildings, you demolish the places where people hang out, they're just going to find another spot.
You can't just eliminate Skid Row by bulldozing part of your city. In the years since, this same tension has been exposed. Even before the pandemic, the homeless problem burst into view with the Wall of Forgotten Natives in 2018, a huge tent encampment appearing, forcing the state to confront the continuing problem of homelessness and drug abuse. It's a phenomenon that you can't eliminate through rearrangement of bricks and mortar.
We don't get rid of social problems by gentrification. Minneapolis and Minnesota are such prosperous places, right? Where people have high levels of education and kind of a great place to live in a lot of ways. But we have social problems here that we perhaps ignore. We had that huge homeless camp in Minneapolis. And I think it's kind of shocking when you see the prosperity of the Twin Cities. And to see a homeless camp of that size shows that Skid Row is alive in a different way.
These were people. These were human beings, thousands of them who lived there, and they built a world for themselves. And it took decades for them to build this community. And they did, to the extent possible, they took care of each other and they watched out for each other. Bacich himself watched out for the gay men who would go to his bar.
So where did they go? The short answer is, we don't know. As callous as sometimes the rhetoric was, the city did realize that they would potentially be creating a new problem if they just put nearly 3,000 people on the street. They were proposing to build a complex for these men. They identified a place where they were going to put it. The neighborhood said no way. They did it again and again and again, and after 9 times, they gave up. And so these guys were kind of on their own in a lot of ways. I love cities because cities always develop in ways that you can never predict, and often the best things that happen in cities are things that planners never planned. The Gateway was never planned to become what it was. We lost something when we got rid of it. There were some things that we could have saved.
Not a trace of it, no. For every dollar that they were paying taxes on them buildings back in the 50s, we are now getting about, I would say, $500-600 because of all the new structures going up. It was an era that I hope you never forget, and I hope you enjoyed this picture. And I thank you very much for watching it. It's an era that I hope none of us will ever forget, and I took these pictures entirely by myself so that some of you that have never seen or know what Skid Row is about have an idea now. And thank you very much. My name is, as I said before, Johnny Rex, the ex-king of Skid Row.
Funding for this program is provided in part by